Wyoming, January 1894. The sky to the north has turned the color of a river stone, not storm gray, not winter white, the specific absolute gray of a sky that has already decided. On the high plains below, a single light burns in the earth itself, not in a cabin, not in a barn, but 8 feet beneath the surface of the frozen ground, a south-facing window almost buried in snow, still glowing. The temperature is dropping 4 degrees every hour. 38 people will not survive what is coming, but somewhere in the darkness between that falling sky and that small buried light, 4 figures are walking, barely walking, moving the way people move when stopping means dying. They have seen the light, they are moving toward it, and the woman, 8 feet underground, the woman who dug this shelter with her own hands, who carved warmth from bedrock, who built something that every man in this territory told her was impossible. She has just heard the knock. The knock came at 10:32 in the evening. 3 sharp blows, not frantic, not desperate, the kind of knock that takes everything a person has left just to lift their arm and make it. Elise Veldhuis heard it from her chair beside the cast iron stove, 8 feet below the surface of the Wyoming prairie. The temperature outside was 41 degrees below zero. The temperature inside her quarters had held at 63 degrees for the past 6 hours without her adding a single log. She did not move immediately. She sat with her hands flat on the table her husband had built in another country, in another life, and she listened to the wind, the way it moved, the way it found every gap and pressed itself through, the way it sounded less like weather and more like something that had decided. 3 more blows, then a voice, barely a voice, the kind that comes from a throat that has been breathing 41 below air for longer than a throat should. She stood 7 steps to the door. She counted them. She counted everything twice, had for years now, and she put her hand on the latch and paused. 1 breath, 2, 3. Before I tell you what she found on the other side of that door, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand what she had built and why and what it cost her. Because what happened in the next 6 days did not happen because Elise was lucky. It happened because of what she had already survived. Let me take you back. Wisconsin, winter of 1889, a small homestead, 12 miles from the nearest town, 14 miles from the nearest doctor, a good cabin by the standards of the time, 20 by 24 feet hewn, logs, a stone chimney, built by a man named Peter Veldhuis, who had learned masonry from his father in the town of Haarlem in the Netherlands before crossing the Atlantic in 1885 with $83 and a young wife named Elise, and the kind of hope that only 30-year-old men who have never seen a Wisconsin winter can carry in their chests. Peter was 34 by the winter of 1889. Elise was 46, and their son Lucas was 6 years old, dark-haired like his father, his mother's pale gray eyes, a boy who had learned to identify 12 different types of cloud formations because his mother had taught him, standing in the doorway of their cabin on summer mornings pointing up, a boy who slept every night with a small wooden boat Peter had carved for his 5th birthday. The night it happened was a Thursday. The temperature had been falling since noon. Peter had spent the afternoon splitting cordwood, stacking it against the east wall of the barn where the wind wouldn't reach it. He came inside at 4, sat beside the hearth. He had been knitting, teaching himself slowly, with the patience of a man who learned new things for the people he loved rather than for himself. A small pair of wool mittens, brown wool, for Lucas, who had asked for mittens like the ones his mother wore. The left one was nearly finished. The right one had barely begun. Elise was in the barn. Their milk cow had gone into labor that morning. The calf was coming breech. She had her hands inside the animal, working carefully when the temperature outside the barn dropped to 32 below zero. She did not come back to the cabin until almost midnight. The lantern in the barn had run out of oil. She walked the 40 feet through snow that came to her knees, and she saw that the cabin had no smoke rising from its chimney. Her heart went cold before her body did. The chimney had cracked, a hairline fracture in the stone, no wider than a horsehair. But in a Wisconsin winter at 32, below a hairline fracture is enough. The fire in the hearth had drawn cold air down through the cracked flue. The smoke had backed up into the cabin. Peter had fallen asleep beside the hearth, with Lucas curled against his chest. The two of them sharing a single buffalo hide blanket, because Airlies had taken the heavier wool one out to the barn. She found them like that. Peter with his arm wrapped around the boy, Lucas with his small fist closed around the wooden boat. Their faces were peaceful. The room was full of carbon monoxide and the kind of silence that lives forever in the memory of the person who walks into it. Airlies sat on the floor beside them for 36 hours. She did not weep, she did not pray, she did not move until a neighbor named Olaf Lindstrom came on Saturday morning to return a borrowed saw and found her there and carried her out of the cabin in his arms because she had stopped being able to walk or speak or close her eyes. This is the woman who came to Wyoming in April of 1892. She arrived in Laramie on a Tuesday afternoon on a stagecoach that had broken an axle once between Cheyenne and the High Plains. She stepped down from that coach with one canvas bag and $61 in a small wooden box she carried in both hands and would not let the driver touch. Inside the wooden box, wrapped in a piece of soft wool that had once been a baby's blanket, were two things. One was a pair of wool mittens, brown wool, one finished, one not. Peter had set the unfinished one down on the evening he died. The knitting needle still threaded through the last row, the yarn uncut, waiting for a next day that never came. Airlies had not unwrapped them since the morning Olaf Lindstrom carried her out of the cabin. The second thing in the box was a folded letter from her younger sister Ragna in Minnesota, who had written from a comfortable house in the Swedish quarter of Minneapolis, asking Airlies to come and live with her, to give up this dream of homesteading, to come and be cared for in a proper household by family who loved her. Airlies had read the letter twice. She had not answered it. She had used the back of the third page to make a list of supplies she would need for the journey west. The day Airlies Veldhuis registered her quarter section at the Laramie Land Office was the same day the office opened for the spring season. There was a line of 19 men ahead of her. Not one of them stepped aside. She stood in that line for 4 hours and 18 minutes. When her turn came, the clerk looked up from his ledger and asked if she was registering on behalf of her husband. She said no. He asked if she was registering on behalf of her father. She said no. He sat there for a long moment with his pen above the page. Then he wrote her name in the column reserved for sole owners. The man behind her in line made a sound through his teeth that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. She did not look at him. She picked up her receipt. She walked out of the land office into the April wind. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for one breath, 2, 3, then she unfolded the letter from Ragna. She read the first paragraph again. She folded it back into her pocket, and she walked to the hardware store to price pickaxes. Now, here is the thing you need to understand about Airlies Veldhuis, the thing that explains every decision she made from that April afternoon forward. Her father's name was Garrett Huckstra. He was a shipwright on the southern shore of Lake Michigan, not a man of words, a man of joints and angles and the way water finds weakness. He had brought Airlies into his workshop at the age of 9 and handed her a plane and said without preamble that the lake killed men who built without understanding what they were building. She spent 12 years in that workshop. She learned how moisture moves through wood, how cold air sinks and warm air rises, and how the behavior of heat in an enclosed space follows rules as reliable as arithmetic. She learned how Earth insulates, how you can dig 3 feet down in July and feel air 15 degrees cooler than the surface, how you can dig 8 feet down in January and feel air that has not changed its temperature since September. She was not a genius. She was a woman who had been taught to pay attention by a father who understood that attention is a form of survival, and she had watched her husband build a chimney, and she had watched her husband's chimney kill him. She was not going to build a chimney. She was not, in fact, going to build anything that relied on combustion to stay warm. The hillside she had chosen ran along the southern edge of her quarter section, sloping down toward the North Platte River drainage at an angle of roughly 14 degrees. The bedrock she needed lay approximately 17 feet below the surface at the highest point of the slope. She had confirmed this by sinking 3 test holes in late September, working alone before the ground froze hard. She marked the corners of her excavation with stakes cut from lodgepole pine. She measured everything twice. She broke ground on the 7th of November, 1892. Pickaxe first, then spade, then a wheelbarrow she had bought used from a farmer outside Cheyenne for $3, and the promise to mend his wife's winter coat. She worked alone, 10 hours a day in November, 8 in December, 6 in January when the temperature dropped below zero, and she could only swing the pick for 15 minutes at a time before her hands began to lose sensation and she had to stop and press them under her arms and breathe. She built fires in the bottom of the excavation each morning to thaw the next layer of earth before she could dig it. She hauled the displaced soil up the slope in the wheelbarrow and piled it along the north edge of the building site, where it would later serve as a windbreak. Every evening when the light failed and the cold came down hard from the ridgeline, she walked back to the small canvas tent she had pitched on the lee side of the rising structure, and she fed the single iron stove she had hauled up the slope herself, and she ate dried venison and hardtack and drank water she had melted from snow, and every night before she slept, she opened the wooden box. She took out the pair of brown wool mittens, the finished one and the unfinished one. She set them beside the stove on a flat stone she had brought specifically for this purpose, so they would be warm when she lay down. She did not unwrap them. She set the package there and lay on her side with her hand on the box, and she listened to the wind working at the canvas above her. And sometimes she thought she could hear very faintly the sound of a 6-year-old boy asking why clouds are different shapes. She did not follow the sound. She had learned in 3 years of surviving that following that sound was the thing that would kill her. By the second week of February, 1893, she had cut a level platform of exposed bedrock 12 feet wide and 24 feet deep into the face of the hill. The walls of the excavation rose 7 feet on 3 sides. The fourth side, the south side, was open to the light. It was on a cold Tuesday morning in that second week that Magnus Frey came to look. Magnus Frey was 58 years old, German-born, a thin man leathery with eyes the color of winter sky and a permanent squint from 30 years of looking into the sun over open prairie. He had built 19 homestead structures between Cheyenne and Laramie, cabins, barns, root cellars, smoke houses. He had a reputation for work that held which, in Wyoming in 1893, was the highest reputation a builder could have. He had buried 2 of his own children. His wife Hilda still woke some nights, certain she could hear them. He did not talk about this. He had a nephew named Callum Vreed, 23 years old, newly arrived from Pennsylvania, who had come west that spring to learn the trade. Magnus had set the boy to work surveying properties east of Laramie. He mentioned this to no one in particular, but it was worth knowing. Magnus came ostensibly because he was passing by on his way to deliver a load of milled timber to a homesteader 6 miles east. He stood at the edge of her excavation in 18 inches of snow, and he looked down into the hole she had cut, and he turned to her and he said very directly, "You are burying yourself alive." Earlys did not answer immediately. She set down her pick. She watched the way the wind moved across the cut surface of the hill, the way it skimmed the top of the excavation and kept going, barely touching what was below. She had been watching that for weeks. She had memorized the patterns. "The barn sits on top," she said finally, in her Dutch-accented English. "Living quarters go beneath, cut into the slope, 3 walls of earth, 1 wall of logs facing south." Magnus Fry pulled his coat tighter. He studied the work she had begun. The foundation log she had positioned, lodgepole pine, cut and stripped and dried through the autumn, notched with the precision that did not come from books. The flat stones she had hauled from the creek bed, each one carefully leveled. He bent down and ran his fingers along one of the notches she had cut. The cut was clean. The angle was right. He straightened up. He looked at her. He looked back at the work. He did not say anything for a long time. "It might work," he said finally, "but you are gambling your life on it." Earlys picked up her pick. "I already lost the other gamble," she said. "This one I understand." She walked back down into the excavation. Magnus Fry watched her swing the pick 3 times. Then he climbed back onto his wagon and drove away and did not speak to anyone until he reached Lewistown Road, at which point he said aloud to no one in particular, "She knows what she's doing," and then said nothing more for the rest of the drive. She worked alone through the rest of February and through March. There were stretches of 9 and 10 days when she did not see another human being. She drank melted snow. She ate what she had packed in November and rationed carefully. She kept records. In a small leather journal she had bought in Cheyenne the previous autumn, she wrote down the date and the temperature and the number of hours worked and the depth of the excavation at its deepest point. Those records would matter later. She did not know that yet. In the first week of June 1893, the structure was complete. Earlys moved into her quarters on a Wednesday evening, the 12th of June. The space was 16 feet by 20 feet of actual living area, with the earth berms cutting into the dimensions on 3 sides. The cast iron stove sat in the northwest corner. 2 real glass windows purchased in Cheyenne for 2 months' wages faced south. A small covered porch protected the south-facing door from drifting snow. The ceiling was 7 feet high. Above her quarters lay 8 inches of barn flooring. Above the flooring, the barn itself, 20 feet by 30 feet, with 12 feet of clearance for the 2 horses and 3 milk cows she had bought from a rancher named Hollins on a credit arrangement she had structured herself to be paid back in calves over 3 years. She lit the stove for the first time in her new home on a June evening when the outside temperature was 67 degrees. The stove heated the quarters to 81. She opened both windows. She sat at the table Peter had built, and she looked around at the earthen walls and the south-facing glass, catching the last of the day's light, and she thought about her father standing at the edge of his workshop dock, pointing at the lake and saying without sentiment that the lake killed men who did not pay attention. She had paid attention. This was what paying attention looked like. She planted 38 acres in wheat that summer. She built a kitchen garden behind the barn. She rendered tallow from a steer Hollins had given her in lieu of part of the calf agreement, and she made 39 candles from the tallow and stored them in the coolest corner of her quarters, where the temperature stayed at 49 degrees even in July. In late June, she helped a woman named Nora Pell rebuild the failing root cellar behind her homestead 3 miles east of Laramie. Nora was 41, a widow. Her husband Edmund had died of a fever 2 years earlier, leaving her with a 10-year-old son named Otto and a quarter section of land she did not entirely know how to work. They worked together for 11 days. Airlies showed her how to dig the cellar deeper, how to line the walls with flat stones set in clay, how to angle the entrance so the prevailing wind would not drive snow into the door in winter. Nora did not say much while they worked. Neither did Airlies. But on the last evening when the work was done and they were washing their hands at the pump, Nora said quietly without looking up, "I don't understand half of what you built, but I understand why you built it." Airlies looked at her. Nora was still looking at her hands. "Edmund used to say I worried too much," Nora said. "He meant it kindly, but there's a difference between worrying too much and understanding exactly what January is capable of." Airlies dried her hands on her apron. "There is," she said. That was the entire conversation. It was enough. The wheat came in at 34 bushels per acre in the second week of September. She worked from before dawn until full dark for 11 straight days. Nora Pell came on the fourth day without being asked and brought Otto with her, and the boy tied sheaves alongside his mother for 9 hours and ate the cold biscuits Airlies had left in a tin in the shade without complaining once. The wheat went out on McCready's wagons on the 19th of September. The check from the buyer arrived on the 2nd of October, $231. She did not deposit it at the First Territorial Bank of Laramie. She put it in the wooden box beside the brown wool mittens. But let me go back, because before the wheat came in, before the check arrived, and before she understood the full shape of what was coming, there was a Tuesday in late July, a morning in Laramie when Airlies had ridden into town with her list of supplies folded in her coat pocket and her mind on the winter ahead, and no particular reason to expect anything other than an ordinary transaction. She walked into the First Territorial Bank to exchange the last of her American silver for paper notes she could carry more easily, and that is where she first met Roscoe Duval. Roscoe Duval was 55 years old, tall, 6 feet and something, with the slightly stooped posture of a man who had spent 3 decades bending over ledgers. His hair was iron gray, cut close. He wore a dark wool suit that had been made in Denver, and he carried a gold pocket watch on a chain that had belonged to his father, who had been a circuit judge in Pennsylvania before the war. He was the president of the First Territorial Bank of Laramie, the largest private depositor in 2 other banks across the territory, a sitting member of the Federal Land Office Advisory Board for Wyoming. He was also, though no one in Laramie knew it yet, a private investor in the proposed northern extension of the Union Pacific Spur Line, which was scheduled to begin survey work through the high plains north of Laramie in the spring of 1895. He saw Airlies Veldhuis standing at the teller's window. He noticed the wooden box she set on the counter beside her purse. He noticed that her boots were worn through at the right heel but had been carefully oiled. He noticed the way she counted the coins twice before she put them in her bag, not because she distrusted the teller, because she counted everything twice. He walked over to her after the transaction was complete. He introduced himself. He smiled the way bankers smile at homesteaders, with the gentle, practiced patience of a man who has watched enough of them fail to have stopped finding it remarkable. He offered her a small business loan to assist with the construction of her structure, a standard arrangement, $250 at 8% interest, repayable over 3 years against the value of the improvements she made to her land. Airlies looked at him. She said politely and without explanation, "No." Duval's smile did not change, but something in his eyes did, a small recalibration, the kind that happens when a man accustomed to being the most prepared person in a conversation encounters someone who doesn't need what he's selling. He told her the bank was always available if circumstances changed. He said this the way another man might say goodbye. He tipped his hat. He watched her walk out of the bank, carrying her wooden box, and he stood at the window for a full minute after she was gone. Then he walked back to his office and sat down at his desk and wrote her name on a piece of paper. Airlies Veldhuis, quarter section, south of the ridge, registered April 14th. He opened his bottom drawer and removed a map. The map had been drawn by a surveyor in the employ of the Union Pacific Railroad Company. It showed the proposed route of the Northern Extension Spur line through the high plains north of Laramie, the route that would, when complete, increase the value of every quarter section along its path by a factor of 30 within a decade. He had been quietly acquiring those quarter sections for 18 months. He had 10 of them. The quarter section Airlies Veldhuis had registered in April sat at the southeast corner of the proposed route, the last unacquired link, the one that made the others worth what he believed they were worth. He set her name down on the map. He did not hurry. Men like Roscoe Duval did not hurry. They used the slow instruments. They used the apparatus of law and commerce and the quiet cultivation of obligation. They used the patience of people who understood that time, when properly managed, works for those who plan ahead. He was not a violent man. He had never raised his hand against another human being. He did not hire men to break fences or burn barns or poison wells. He used the slower instruments. 3 days after Airlies declined his loan, Roscoe Duval had a quiet dinner at the Territorial Hotel with the senior clerk of the Laramie Land Office. A very good dinner. He asked a number of careful questions about the legal definition of a habitable dwelling under the Homestead Act of 1862. He listened to the answers. He paid for the dinner. He went home and wrote a second name on a second piece of paper. This one he filed in the locked drawer of his office desk. For use at the appropriate time, the envelope arrived on a Friday afternoon in the first week of August. Airlies was sitting on the south-facing porch of her quarters when the mail carrier rode up. She opened the envelope. She read the letter inside. She read it twice. She did not change expression. She thanked the carrier for the delivery. She walked back into her quarters. She set the letter on the table. She sat down beside the stove. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It was signed by the acting commissioner of the Land Office for the Wyoming Territory on the recommendation of an advisory board member identified only by initials. It informed Miss Airlies Veldhuis that a formal challenge had been filed against her registered claim under the Homestead Act of 1862. The challenge alleged that her constructed dwelling did not meet the statutory definition of a habitable structure on the grounds that a structure consisting primarily of subterranean excavation, regardless of its functional adequacy, did not constitute a dwelling within the meaning of Section 4 of the Act. A formal hearing would be held in Cheyenne on the 14th day of April, 1894. If she failed to appear or failed to successfully defend her claim, her registration would be revoked. The land, together with all improvements, would revert to the public domain and be made available for re-registration. The letter did not mention Roscoe Duval by name. It did not need to. Airlies sat beside the stove for a long time. The afternoon light moved across the floor of her quarters. Outside, somewhere in the wheat field, she had planted with her own hands a hawk called once over the standing grain that was 3 weeks from harvest. She had 8 months. She walked to the stove. She did not put the letter inside. She set it on the table beside the wooden box. She walked outside. She stood in the wheat field and she looked at the hillside she had cut into and the barn she had raised and the structure that had taken her every dollar and every breath and every hour of 2 years. She watched the wind move through the wheat. She did not weep. That night,
She opened the wooden box. She took out the brown wool mittens, the finished one and the unfinished one. She held them in both hands for a long time. She set them beside the stove on the flat stone. She sat down on the floor next to them. "I am not done," she said quietly. She said it in Dutch, the way she had spoken to Lucas when he was small and frightened of something and needed to hear her voice saying a true thing. "I am not done yet." The wind picked up outside. The first cool wind of August. The wind that means autumn is coming. Somewhere across the basin, a coyote called once. The sound traveled clean and far in the dry air. 8 months. That was how long Airlies Veldhuis had to prove that what she had built was a home. What she did not yet know, as she sat there beside her stove on that August evening, one hand on the wooden box, one ear on the wind, was that Roscoe Duval had already begun making a different kind of move. He had already spoken quietly to the senior clerk at Peterson's General Mercantile. He had already made a private inquiry at the office of the only blacksmith in Laramie. He had already begun the slow, patient work of cutting Airlies Veldhuis off from the small and necessary commerce of frontier life, the kind of work that does not leave fingerprints, the kind that bankers had been perfecting for 200 years. And what Airlies did not know, what she could not have known, was that a man named Magnus Fry was at that very moment sitting at his kitchen table 3 miles to the north, holding a letter of his own, a letter from the First Territorial Bank informing him that the terms of his farm mortgage could be extended indefinitely so long as Mr. Frey continued to demonstrate good judgment in his public statements regarding matters of mutual concern. Magnus Frey sat with that letter for a long time. His wife Hilda was asleep in the next room. He looked out the kitchen window across the dark high plains toward the ridge 3 miles south, where if he looked carefully enough on a clear night, he could sometimes see the small, warm light of Airlies Veldhuis's south-facing windows. He understood in that moment what he was going to have to do, and he understood in the same moment with the particular clarity of a man who has built things all his life and knows what load a joint can bear, that doing it was going to cost him something real. The wind moved across the high plains. The first cold air of autumn was already gathering in the mountains to the west, already building toward what would become, in January of the following year, the worst blizzard the Wyoming Territory had seen in a generation. But that was still 5 months away. Tonight, Airlies Veldhuis sat beside her stove in the earth she had carved into a home, and she did not yet know how much she was going to lose before she understood how much she could save. The silence at Peterson's General Mercantile happened on a Saturday, second week of August, 1893. Airlies rode into Laramie with her supply list folded in her coat pocket, 4 pounds of coffee, 2 tins of lamp oil, a new whetstone for the scythe, half a pound of nails, a bolt of cotton muslin. Small things, ordinary things, the kind of list a woman writes without thinking because she has written it a dozen times before. She tied her horse at the post outside. She walked in. The bell above the door rang. 2 men at the counter, a rancher named Whitmore and a drover she didn't know, both turned to look at her. Both looked away. Neither said good morning, which was odd, because they always said good morning. Jasper Peterson, the owner's nephew, 22 years old, a young man who had always been stiffly pleasant to her in the way of someone raised by a strict mother, went very still when she approached. She set her list on the counter. Jasper looked at the list, looked at the shelves behind him, fully stocked, every item she needed, sitting exactly where it had always sat, looked back at the list, opened his mouth, closed it. "I'm very sorry," he said, barely above a whisper. "We're unfortunately out of all of these at the present time." Airlies looked at him. She looked at the shelves. The coffee was right there, 2 full sacks of it. I see, she said. She picked up her list, folded it back into her pocket, walked out. The bell rang behind her. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for one breath, two, three. Then she walked 4 doors down to the blacksmith. The forge was hot. Cassius Granger was at the anvil. He saw her coming through the open door, and he set down his hammer, and he wiped his hands on his leather apron, and he met her at the threshold before she could step inside. "Very sorry," he said, not meeting her eyes, the color of beet juice from his jawline to his collar. "Schedule's completely full, foreseeable future, can't take on new work." He was very, very sorry. Airlie stood there. She looked at the cold anvil, the empty queue of work on his bench, the complete and obvious absence of anything keeping him busy. "I understand," she said. She turned around. She walked back to her horse. She untied the reins. She climbed up onto the saddle, and she sat there for a moment, not moving, looking down the length of Laramie's main street. 7 businesses, 2 churches, the small wooden bank with the brass plaque on its door, First Territorial Bank of Laramie, Roscoe J. Duvall, President. She understood, completely, immediately, without needing to verify a single detail. It had taken him 11 days. He had not raised his voice. He had not signed his name to anything. He had simply visited each merchant over the course of 10 quiet evenings and spoken to them about sound business practices, about the importance of prudent relationships, about how the bank had been so pleased to extend credit and accommodation to the good businesses of Laramie over the years, about how certain ongoing legal reviews made it wise to be cautious about serving homesteaders whose claims were under federal examination. He had not mentioned her name. He had not needed to. There was only one homesteader in Laramie whose claim was under federal review. Airlie rode back to her quarters section without stopping. When she reached the homestead, she unsaddled her horse, walked into her quarters, sat down at the wooden table, and pulled a piece of paper toward her. She wrote 3 lists. The first, every supply she would need to survive the winter without making another trip into Laramie. The second, the names of merchants in Cheyenne, 90 miles south, who had no direct business relationship with the First Territorial Bank of Laramie. The third, everything she could produce on her own land, by her own hands, between August and November. She sat with the 3 lists for a long time. The afternoon sun moved across the floor. The first cut from a man like Roscoe Duvall is the one that teaches you what kind of fight you're in. And Airlie understood by sundown that Saturday that she was not in a fight about land or about dwellings or about the technical definition of a statute. She was in a fight about whether a woman could be made invisible by a man who had decided for reasons that had nothing to do with her that her erasure would be convenient. She did not panic. She did not write to Ragna in Minneapolis. She did not even speak of it to Nora Pell when Nora came by the following Tuesday with a basket of late summer plums. They sat on the south porch and they shelled beans together, and Nora talked about Otto and the way he had started asking questions about clouds, why they were different shapes, what made them move, and Airlie listened and did not say a word about the merchants or the bank or the letter that sat on her table. She simply changed her plan. By the end of August, Airlie had written to Magnus Fry's nephew, Callum Vreed, who had been surveying properties east of Laramie for his uncle. She asked if he would be willing in the coming months to take measurements and temperature readings at her structure. She framed it as a professional inquiry. She said she was building a record. Callum wrote back within the week. He would be glad to help. She had also arranged through a freight hauler named McCready, who ran loads between Cheyenne and the High Plains twice a month, for her wheat to go directly to a buyer in Cheyenne at harvest, bypassing the Laramie elevator entirely. She arranged for her winter supplies to come back on McCready's return trip. 2 shipments,
one in October, one in early December, sourced from merchants who had never heard of Roscoe Duval. Macready charged her twice the going rate. She paid it without negotiating. She understood that he was charging her twice the rate because he understood that she had no other options, and she understood that this was simply the price of being a woman alone in Wyoming when the man with the bank decided to make her a problem. The wheat harvest started on the 8th of September. 11 days, dawn to full dark. Nora Pell came on the 4th day without being asked. She brought Otto with her. The boy worked alongside his mother for 9 hours and ate his biscuits in the shade without a word of complaint. And in the evening, when they were walking back to the wagon, Nora said quietly, without looking at Airlies, "I don't know exactly what is happening to you in town, but I know what is happening to you in this field, and I'm here for the second one." Airlies put her hand on Nora's shoulder. She did not speak. She did not need to. The check from the Cheyenne buyer arrived on the 2nd of October, $231. She put it in the wooden box beside the mittens, and then on a cold morning in the first week of October, Magnus Frey rode out to her property alone. No wagon, no tools, just a single horse, and the slow way he dismounted, the way men past 58 dismount in October, cold joint by joint, with the small audible complaints that cold extracts from old work. He did not tie the horse. He stood in front of her on the south porch with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, looking at the ground between his boots. "Frau Veldhuis," he said, his German accent still thick after 30 years, "I have come to tell you that I cannot speak for you at the hearing in April." Airlies set down her axe. She waited. "I had hoped," Magnus said, turning the hat, "that I might be able to come to Cheyenne and testify about the structure, the engineering. I had hoped this for some months. When your letter came in September asking Callum to take measurements, I thought perhaps there is still a way." A pause. "The bank holds my mortgage. They have held it since 1887. Last week I received a letter." He stopped. "The terms will be extended, so long as I demonstrate good judgment in matters of mutual concern." He looked up at her. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept in 8 days. "I have a wife," he said. "I am 58 years old. I have nothing else. If I lose the farm, Hilda is on the road in winter, and I do not know what becomes of us. I cannot lose the farm." Airlies stood very still. She could have said many things. She could have told him about Peter, about Lucas, about the 30 steps through the snow, and the chimney with no smoke, and the floor where she had sat for 36 hours. She could have asked him whether Hilda's comfort was worth more than the truth. She could have said a great many things that would have been both accurate and devastating. She said none of them. "I understand, Mr. Fry," she said. "You have your family. You have done what a good man does. Please don't trouble yourself further." Magnus made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. He nodded once. He turned around. He climbed back onto his horse with a slowness that had nothing to do with his age and everything to do with what he was carrying. He rode away without looking back. Airlies watched him until he disappeared over the north rise. Then she picked up the axe. She set a fresh piece of wood on the chopping block. She brought the axe down. She split it. She set another piece. She split that one. She worked until the light was gone. That night she did not open the wooden box. She did not take out the mittens. She sat beside the stove with her hands flat on the table, and she stared at the small iron door of the firebox, and she thought very quietly and very clearly about what she was actually fighting for. Not the land, not the structure, not even the hearing in April. She was fighting for the right to have been right, for the right to say, "I built this with my hands, with my father's knowledge and my own attention and 4 years of grief that I turned into something useful instead of something that consumed me."
and it is good, and it keeps the cold out, and no banker and no statute and no advisory board member with a private railroad interest has the authority to look at what I built and tell me it doesn't count. The October wind came down hard from the Medicine Bow Range. The first snow fell on the 9th of November, 6 inches, gone within 4 days. The second snow fell on the 21st, 14 inches, temperature dropping to 4 below. Airlise lit the stove twice that day and watched the thermometer on the wall of her quarters. She had mounted it carefully at chest height, away from the stove, away from the windows, a neutral reading. At 6 in the evening, with the temperature outside at 4 below zero and the stove running on half its capacity, the thermometer on her wall read 61 degrees. She wrote it down in her leather journal. She had been writing down every reading since June. Date, outside temperature, inside temperature, stove usage, wood consumed, 16 pages of records, precise, consistent, the kind of records that a lawyer could use or an engineer could verify or a land office commissioner could not easily dismiss. She had not known when she started keeping them that she would need them, but she had kept them anyway because her father had taught her that attention is a form of survival and you do not wait until you need the evidence to start collecting it. December came down cold, real cold, the kind that doesn't apologize, the kind that settles into the high plains like it has been waiting all year to come home. And in the second week of December, Magnus Fry came back. This time he came in his wagon. This time his wife Hilda was on the bench beside him. And this time, in the bed of the wagon wrapped in 3 blankets lay their daughter. Her name was Britta, 21 years old, dark-haired, her father's jaw, her mother's eyes. She had been working as a seamstress in Laramie since September, living in a rooming house on the east side of town. She was the color of skim milk. Her breathing was shallow and rapid in a way that Airlise recognized before Magnus said a word. "The chimney in her rooming house," Magnus called out as he pulled the team up beside the south porch. His voice fractured clean down the middle. It cracked. The smoke filled the room. She was in there 3 hours before anyone noticed. And then the cold. She has been coughing since Tuesday. Her breathing. He stopped. He climbed down from the wagon. "Frau Veldhuis, my daughter is dying." Airlise was already moving. She lifted Britta down from the wagon bed, the girl's weight barely registering. She had lost so much and carried her through the south-facing door, down the steps, into the quarters below. She laid Britta on her own bed. Hilda came down the steps, behind her weeping silently, with one hand pressed against her mouth. Airlise put her hand on Britta's forehead. Hot enough to burn, she lifted the blanket and put her ear against the girl's chest and listened. The wet, rattling crackle beneath the rapid breathing, lower lobes of both lungs filling with fluid. She had heard that sound before. She had heard it from her younger brother in 1864 when she was 17 and he was 9, and she had heard it from her own chest once briefly in the winter of 1878 and had known immediately what it was and had treated it herself and had survived. She knew exactly what to do. "Mr. Frey," she said without looking up. "The root cellar is north of the barn, 3rd shelf second from the left glass jar, willow bark. Same shelf to the right of it, mustard powder in a tin. Bring both." Magnus was already gone. "Mrs. Frey, 3 pots of water on the stove, all 3. Keep them boiling. Do not let any of them stop." Hilda moved, and Airlise worked. She made a willow bark tea so concentrated it was the color of strong coffee. She lifted Britta's head into her lap and fed the girl spoonfuls of it for the first 3 hours. Patient, steady, 1 spoonful at a time. The fever broke once and rose again. She made a mustard plaster powder mixed with hot water, spread on clean muslin, and laid it across Britta's chest. Changed it every 2 hours. Not 1 hour and 45 minutes. Not 2 hours and 10 minutes.
2 hours exactly, because a mustard plaster left on too long burns the skin and does more damage than the illness. And a mustard plaster taken off too soon does nothing at all. Airlies had learned this from a woman in Wisconsin, whose name she could no longer remember, who had learned it from her own mother, who had come from somewhere in Scandinavia with a body of practical knowledge that no medical school had ever formally acknowledged. She kept the south-facing door cracked 1 inch even when the temperature outside was 16 below, because pneumonia kills in still air, because the air in the quarters had to move. Even if moving it meant burning more wood, she burned more wood. They worked through Tuesday night, through Wednesday night, through Thursday. The fever rose, fell, rose again. Britta mumbled in German, her parents' language, the one that came first when the mind let go of control. Hilda sat on the floor beside the bed and answered her, and Airlies did not need to understand the words to know what a mother and daughter say to each other in the small hours of the third night. On Thursday evening, Britta began to mumble in English, single words: the river, the blue dress, the singer machine in the shop window. Then very clearly 3 times in a row, "Mama." Hilda could not answer. She had stopped being able to make sounds an hour earlier. Airlies set down the cloth she had been using. She moved to the floor beside the bed. She lifted Britta's head into her lap. She bent down close to the girl's ear, and she began to sing. She sang in Dutch, the lullaby her father had sung to her on the shore of Lake Michigan on summer evenings when she was small and the lake was loud and she was afraid of something she couldn't name. A very old song, older than any country either of them had come from. The kind of melody that knows how to travel from one person's chest into another person's chest without asking permission. She had sung this lullaby to Lucas every night for 6 years. She had sung it to him on the last night, before she went to the barn, before she walked back through the snow. Before. She had not sung it since. She sang it now, very softly, into Britta's ear. She sang it through once. Britta's breathing slowed. She sang it through a second time. Britta's hand moved slightly on the blanket, just the fingers, just the smallest possible indication that something was still listening. Airlies kept singing. By the 3rd time through, she could not keep her voice steady. By the 3rd time, the tears were running down her face, the first tears she had cried since the morning Olaf Lindstrom had carried her out of her cabin in Wisconsin 4 years to the month. Hilda Fry, sitting on the other side of the bed, looked up, and she understood in that moment that the woman singing her daughter back to life was not singing only to her daughter. Airlies finished the lullaby. She did not start it again. She lowered Britta's head gently to the pillow. She wiped her own face with the back of her wrist. She pressed her hand to Britta's forehead. The fever had begun to break. By Friday dawn, the worst had passed. By Saturday, Britta was sitting up. By the following Wednesday, she was eating thin broth and asking in a voice still ragged at the edges when she could go home. Magnus had repaired the chimney in his own farmhouse by then, working dawn to dusk through 6 December days, refusing rest, his hands cracked and bleeding from the cold mortar. On the 9th day after they had arrived, he loaded his wife and daughter into the wagon. Hilda came to Airlies before they left. She came alone, while Magnus was outside hitching the team. She walked down into the quarters and stood at the bottom of the steps and looked across the room at Airlies, who was wrapping a small packet of willow bark and mustard powder for them to take home. "She would have died in our cabin," Hilda said, simply. "Even with a working chimney now, it is too cold there, this place." She looked at the earthen walls, the south-facing windows catching the December light, the steady warmth that had not varied in 9 days. It holds warmth like a mother holds a child. Airlies kept wrapping the packet. Hilda took 2 steps closer. "Who did you lose?" she said. Not a question, a recognition. Airlie stopped wrapping. She set the packet on the table. She stood very still for a moment, with her back to Hilda. Then she turned around. She told Hilda about Peter. She told her about the cabin in Wisconsin, about the hairline crack in the chimney, about the buffalo hide blanket, and the breech-born calf, and the 30 steps through the snow, about the wooden boat Lucas had been holding, about the 36 hours on the floor before Olaf came to borrow the saw. She did not cry while she spoke. She had already cried in the night. When she finished, Hilda walked across the room and put her arms around her. The two women stood in the center of the underground quarters. Neither of them spoke. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows in long, pale rectangles across the wooden floor. The Frys left that afternoon. By Christmas, the story of what had happened to Britta had spread through every household within 20 miles of Laramie, carried by Hilda to the women, carried by Magnus very quietly to the men, the way news travels in a small territory, not through newspapers but through the specific human need to tell someone what you witnessed. Roscoe Duvall heard about it in the first week of January. He heard it from his housekeeper's sister, who had been at the women's auxiliary meeting at the Methodist church. He set down his coffee cup. He looked out the window of his dining room. He understood in that moment that he was beginning to lose the public side of this fight, even as he continued to win the private one. A woman who had saved a 21-year-old girl from pneumonia in an underground dwelling had become something more dangerous than a homesteader. She had become a story. And stories in a territory the size of Wyoming had a way of reshaping the opinions of jurors and witnesses, and in time even the careful private arrangements of bankers. He decided to make an offer. He arrived at Airlies Veldhuis homestead on the afternoon of January 22nd, 1894, alone, riding a chestnut gelding worth more than the total value of her livestock, wearing a black overcoat trimmed with beaver fur, carrying in his inside pocket 3 documents, 2 of them already signed. He knocked on the south-facing door. Airlies opened it. She did not invite him in. Roscoe Duvall removed his hat. He stood on the small covered porch and he spoke in the calm, professional voice he used at board meetings. He told her that he had been thinking seriously about her situation, that he respected what she had built, that he respected her tenacity and what she had done for the Frey family. He removed the documents from his pocket. The first was a private purchase offer, $3,400 for her quarter section, the structure, the barn, the livestock, the standing improvements, approximately 4 times the going market rate for a Wyoming homestead in January of 1894. The second was a guarantee that if she signed and vacated within 30 days, the formal challenge to her claim would be withdrawn before the April hearing. No judgment, no public record. She would walk away as a woman who had simply chosen to sell her land at a profit. The third was a first-class railroad voucher from Laramie to Denver, departing February 7th. He laid all 3 documents on the small wooden bench beside the door. He did not press her to look at them. "Mrs. Veldhuis," he said, and it was the first time he had ever called her Mrs., and she noticed it, and he saw her notice. "My wife died in the winter of 1881, he said. Pneumonia. She was 36 years old. The house I built for her was not warm enough. I knew it in October of that year. I had other things to attend to. By December, it was too late." He paused. The wind moved across the porch. "I have a son. His name is James. He is 16 years old, and he lives in Denver with his grandmother. Because I have not known how to be in the same house with him without seeing what I cost him, I am building a future for him instead. The railroad will come through this territory. Your land is the last piece I need to complete what I have assembled for him." He looked at her directly. "I am not your enemy. I am simply a man who decided to do in money what he could not do any other way. and I will tell you honestly, if you are wise, you will take this offer. The federal hearing will not go well for you, and you will leave Wyoming with nothing, and your husband and your son will have died for a hillside that was always going to belong to someone like me. He turned around. He walked down the steps. He mounted his horse. He rode away without looking back. Airlie stood in the open doorway for a long time. The wind lifted the 3 documents off the bench, scattered them across the small porch. She watched them flutter against the railing. She did not gather them. She went down into her quarters. She sat at the table. She did not light a lamp, though the afternoon was failing. The light from the south-facing windows fell across the table, across her hands, across the wooden box at the center of the table. She opened the box. She took out the mittens, both of them, the finished one and the unfinished one. She held them in her hands for a long time, and then she picked up a pen. She found a clean sheet of paper. She wrote, "Dear Mr. Duval, after careful consideration of your offer of January 22nd, 1894, I have decided to accept the terms as you have described them." She kept writing, formal, correct, third person, the language of a woman who understood how documents worked and how they needed to read. She signed her name. She blotted the ink. She folded the letter into thirds. She reached for the beeswax candle on the table to seal it, and stopped. Her hand was on the unfinished mitten. She had not planned to pick it up. Her hand had simply gone there. She held it. 12 rows of brown wool. The knitting needle still threaded through the last row, exactly where Peter had set it down on the evening of Thursday, December 5th, 1889, when he had put the work aside to stoke the fire and fallen asleep beside the hearth with Lucas against his chest. He had been going to finish it the next day. There had been going to be a next day. The needle was still there. The yarn was still uncut, still attached to the ball, still waiting in the way that unfinished things wait for the person who intended to come back. He built it to keep you warm, she thought. He built the chimney to keep you warm. He built this mitten to keep you warm. He spent his whole life building things to keep you warm, and he died in the cold because one stone cracked, and he didn't know it. And, she thought, if I sign this letter, I am saying that the building does not matter, that the knowing does not matter, that the attention and the records and the 14-degree bedrock and the 63-degree floor, that none of it matters, because a man with a railroad map and a dead wife and a son in Denver decided it shouldn't. I am saying Peter's chimney was right and mine was wrong. I am saying the wrong thing built the wrong way still gets to win. She set the mitten down. She picked up the sealed letter. She held it over the beeswax candle, let the flame catch the edge of the paper. The paper burned. She held it until the flame was almost at her fingers. Then she dropped the last burning corner into the empty tin cup beside the candle, watched it burn out. The room smelled for a few seconds of beeswax and cheap paper. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark. Outside, the wind began to come up, out of the north, the way the worst winds in Wyoming always come, not arriving so much as being released, building across the high plains at a steady, increasing rate over the next 18 hours until by dawn on Tuesday, the 23rd of January, the wheat stubble in the fields was laid flat, and the barometer had dropped 4 inches in 6 hours, and the sky to the north had turned the color of a river stone. And Airlie's Veldhuis sat in the dark with the unfinished mitten in her hands, and she thought, not yet. I am not done yet. The coal was coming. She knew it the way her father had known when to get the boats off the water, not from the sky, from the air itself, the way it moved, the way it had stopped moving, the particular quality of silence that precedes the kind of weather that teaches you very quickly and without mercy exactly what you built and whether you built it right. She lit a single candle. She stood up. She put the mittens back in the box. She closed the lid. She walked to the stove and fed it 3 split logs, and she watched the temperature needle on the thermometer begin to climb, and she thought about the 6 cords of wood stacked in the barn above her head, and the 200 pounds of dried beans and venison and flour in the root annex behind the north wall, and the 2 glass windows sealed with fresh putty in October, and the bedrock 8 feet down that had not changed its temperature since September. She had built this for January. This exact January. She just hadn't known it yet when she was swinging the pickaxe. Thaddeus Hollins rode up at 20 minutes past noon on Tuesday. His horse was lathered and skittish. He did not dismount. "Barometer dropped 4 inches since midnight," he called out, his face already raw from the wind. "My bones say this is the bad one. What's your wood supply?" "4 cords in the barn," Airlies called back. "Another cord down here." "That'll do." He looked at her, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. "You stay where you are. You hear me? Not for livestock, not for wood, not for anything. Once it hits you, stay inside." "I understand." He looked at her for one more moment. "Airlies," he said, first time he had ever used her given name. "You stay safe." "Same to you," she said. He turned the horse. He rode hard for his own ranch 4 miles to the north. The storm hit at 4:47 in the afternoon. Airlies was at the south-facing windows when it came. She watched the wall of white advance across the high plains from the north, a moving cliff of snow and wind 1,000 feet high at its leading edge, driven by sustained winds. The newspapers would later report at 71 miles per hour. The wall hit the ridge above her property at 4:47 exactly. She watched the trees on the far ridge bend, snap, disappear into the white. She felt the structure above her shudder. She heard the timbers of the barn flex against their bracing. The light in the south-facing windows turned to nothing. Airlies stepped back from the windows. She walked to her stove. She fed it 3 split logs. She sat down in the chair beside it. The temperature outside dropped through the evening. By 6 in the evening, 17 below. By 8:26 below. By 9:34 below. The wind did not pause. It was a constant living roar, like standing beside a freight train that did not move and did not end. Inside her quarters, 63 degrees. She had not added wood in 2 hours. She had not needed to. At 10:32 in the evening of January 23rd, 1894, the moment this story has been moving toward since the first paragraph, the knock came. 3 sharp blows, and now you know everything you need to know. You know who she is. You know what she lost. You know what she built and why, and what it cost her. You know about the chimney that cracked, and the floor where she sat for 36 hours, and the lullaby she hadn't sung in 4 years, and the mitten with the needle still in it, and the letter that burned in a tin cup, and the 4-inch barometer drop, and Thaddeus Hollins riding hard for home, and the wall of white that hit the ridge at 4:47. Now, Airlies Veldhuis stood up from her chair. She did not pause. She had already done her pausing. She crossed the 7 steps to the door. She lifted the latch. She pulled the door inward against the storm. Outside on the small covered porch, in the howling dark of the worst blizzard the Wyoming Territory would see for 30 years, 4 people stood, crusted in ice, barely upright. Reverend Silas Aldrich, the man who had delivered a sermon in August suggesting that a widow homesteading alone was an affront to natural order, stood nearest the door with his beard frozen into a single white sheet across his chest. Behind him, Nora Pell, and in Nora's arms, Otto, 10 years old, his small body slack against his mother, his eyes half open and unfocused, his hands, both of them the color of old candle wax, from the fingertips to the second knuckle. And Callum Vrede, 24 years old, Magnus Frey's nephew, who had been staying in a surveyor's shack 2 miles to the west. His right glove was gone, his bare hand the same color as Otto's fingers. 4 people. Airlies counted them, then counted again. 4 was correct. She moved. Not quickly in the way of panic, quickly in the way of someone who has already decided in advance exactly what to do when this moment comes, because she had imagined this moment, not this specific night, not these 4 specific people, but the general shape of it. She had imagined it while she was building, while she was sealing the windows and calculating the wood supply and measuring the bedrock depth. She had built this place for the moment when someone knocked. She stripped Callum's torn coat off him first because he was nearest and because his bare hand was the most immediate problem. No asking permission, no explaining. She unbuttoned his coat at the collar and pulled it down off his shoulders and let it fall to the floor, peeled the frozen wool shirt off him, could see the red and white mottling across his chest where the cold had already begun working into the muscle. 2 wool blankets around his shoulders, push him toward the stove. Same for Reverend Aldrich. She did not look at his face while she opened his coat. She had learned in Wisconsin, in grief in all the years between, that a man's dignity in a moment of helplessness is best preserved by treating his body as a problem to be solved, not a person to be embarrassed. The coat came off. Dry clothes went on. She moved. Nora she left for last because Nora was already moving, working the buttons of her own coat with trembling fingers, the slow, deliberate trembling of hands by mom that have gone past pain into the dull, blank state that comes just before frostbite makes its permanent decisions. Airlies took Otto. She carried him to the stove. She set him on the floor on his mother's coat and unwrapped the buffalo robe Nora had bundled around him and unwound the scarf from his face and removed his mittens. His hands were the worst of it. The fingertips of both hands had gone past white into the deep waxy gray that meant the tissue underneath had begun to die. Airlies knew this color. She had seen it once before on the right foot of a Norwegian fisherman in her father's harbor town in 1871, who had lost 3 toes before his wife had managed to thaw him beside a kitchen stove. Mrs. Pell, her voice was steady because she had decided it would be steady. The basin from beside the washstand, fill it with water from the kettle, warm, not hot, the temperature you'd use to bathe a newborn. Do you understand? Nora understood. Nora moved. Airlies worked on Otto's hands for 40 minutes. She did not let the water go above 104 degrees, the temperature that thaws frozen tissue without killing the cells underneath. She held each of his hands in the basin in turn, and she watched the color come back. And it came back wrong. Patches of pink returning, but white spots remaining in the very tips of 3 fingers, on his right hand and 2 on his left. She wrapped his hands in soft cloth, kept the cloth dry, did not break the blisters when they came up. Otto did not wake. His breathing was shallow but steady. His skin was the cold, pale white of a child whose body had spent everything it had just on the walk through the storm. From the chair beside the stove, Reverend Aldrich spoke, his voice not recognizable as the voice he used for sermons, smaller, more honest. Our cabins, he said. The wind took Nora's roof. Mine was filling with snow through cracks I hadn't found yet. Callum's shack. He stopped. We saw your light through the snow. We walked. I don't know how long. I don't know how we didn't lose Otto in the dark. Airlies put a tin cup of warm broth into his hands. Drink this slowly, she said. Then she went back to Otto. The temperature outside continued to drop. By midnight, 38 below. Inside the quarters, the thermometer read 58 degrees, down 5 from where it had been when her guests arrived. 4 cold bodies pulled the heat from the room faster than the stove alone could replace it. Airlies fed the stove, 3 more logs, watched the needle climb back towards 60. She did the arithmetic the way her father had taught her, on paper with a pencil sitting at the table, while her 4 uninvited guests slept Callum and Reverend Aldrich on the floor, wrapped in every blanket she owned. Nora curled in the chair, with her coat over her like a quilt Otto on the bed. Wood supply 4 cords in the barn, 1 cord in the quarters. Food supply enough for 1 person for 12 days, 5 people for. She divided and divided again, not quite 3 days at full rations, 5 days at 2/3, perhaps 8 days at half. She wrote everything down. Then she blew out the lamp and sat in the dark beside the stove, and she did the second kind of arithmetic, the kind that has no numbers, the kind that asks what kind of storm is this, and how long do I have, and what happens to a 10-year-old boy's hands if the answer is longer than 8 days. Day 1 became day 2. The temperature outside fell to 41 below by Wednesday dawn. The wind did not slacken. Airlies had read everything available about Wyoming blizzards before she had built this structure. She knew that storms of this severity typically broke within 36 hours. This one did not break. It held through Wednesday night, through all of Thursday. On Thursday afternoon, something shifted in the barn above them, a low cracking sound, then a heavy groan traveling down through 8 inches of barn flooring directly above their heads. The cattle bellowed. Callum Vrida, recovered enough by Thursday to be useful, looked at the ceiling. "One of the support braces," he said. "Snow load on the north face. We have to go up." "We don't," Airlie said. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She kept her hands where they were folded on the table. "Miss Veldhuis," Callum's voice careful, urgent. "If a second brace goes, the whole north side could come down. The weight could—" "Mr. Vreed," she looked at him, "you will go up there, and you will not come back down. The wind at this temperature will kill you in 4 minutes. The barn was designed for snow loads up to 4 feet on every surface. The diagonal bracing distributes the load. If a brace is gone, the structure will redistribute. A beat. The cattle may be lost," she said. "The cattle are not worth your life. Sit down." Callum sat down. He did not speak again for 2 hours. Day 3, Friday morning. The wind dropped briefly. For the first time in 58 hours, the roaring outside the south-facing windows fell from a scream to a moan. The temperature climbed from 41 below to 32 below. The light coming through the snow, packed against the windows, changed from black to a dim gray. Callum suggested quietly that they make a run for Laramie. Airlies walked to the south-facing windows. She looked out through the small gap at the top where the snow had not yet reached. The drift on the north side of the barn was 11 feet deep. She could see no fences, no horizon, no structures. The terrain was unrecognizable. The world had been replaced with white. "We stay," she said. By evening on Friday, the wind picked back up. By midnight, it was as bad as it had ever been. Day 4, Saturday, Nora broke. Not loudly, not in the way of a woman who has decided to fall apart, in the quiet way of a woman who has been holding herself together for 72 hours by willpower alone and has simply run out of willpower. She sat in the corner of the room and she put her face in her hands and she cried without making any sound, the way women of her generation had been taught to cry privately without inconveniencing anyone, with one hand pressed against her mouth as if the grief could be kept in. She cried for her cabin, which she knew by now was gone. She cried for the photograph of Edmund on the mantel, which she had not had time to take. She cried for the small wooden rocking horse in the corner of Otto's room that Edmund had built the spring before he died. Otto, awake now and weak, watched his mother cry. He was 10 years old, and his hands hurt in a way he had never experienced, and he did not know how to fix this. He was learning in the particular devastating way that children learn such things,
that his mother was a person who could be broken, and the learning frightened him in a way the storm itself had not. Airlie sat down on the floor beside Nora. She did not say it will be all right, because she did not know if it would be. She did not say be strong, because Nora had been strong for 4 days and was entitled to stop. She simply sat there, the way she had sat beside Nora in the wheat field 2 summers ago when Nora had cried for Edmund, present, not fixing, not advising, not redirecting, just there. After a long time, Nora leaned sideways until her head rested against Airlie's shoulder. The 2 women sat that way for an hour. Reverend Aldrich watched them from his chair. He had stopped attempting to lead them in prayer on the 2nd day. He had understood somewhere in the middle of the 2nd night that the woman who had taken them in did not need anyone to lead her, that the rest of them were in a very real sense simply guests in her competence. He had preached in August that a widow living alone underground was a kind of disorder. He sat now in the warmth of that underground space, and he looked at the earthen walls and the thermometer that had not dropped below 58 degrees, and he did not know yet what he was going to say about it, but he understood that he was going to have to say something. Day 5. The food ran short. The last of the venison had gone into the stew on Saturday evening. Sunday morning flour potatoes, dried beans lard, and a small jar of preserved plums Nora had brought as a gift in August, and which Airlie's had been saving for Christmas. She opened the plums. She served them in the tin cups. Nobody said anything about it being a special occasion. Otto's fever began at 10 in the morning, gradual at first, a warmth to his skin, a brightness in his eyes that was not the right kind of bright. By noon his cheeks were flushed. By 2 in the afternoon the cloth wrappings on the worst of his frost-bitten fingers showed the first dark spotting, black at the edges, the tissue beginning to break down. By 4 in the afternoon, Airlie's could feel the heat radiating off Otto's skin from a foot away without touching him. Nora understood what was happening before Airlie said anything. She had nursed Edmund through his final fever. She knew the smell of a body beginning to be overwhelmed. Airlie's, she said, one word, quiet, the voice of a woman who has already lived through this once and cannot believe she is here again. Airlie's did not answer. She walked to the cold storage behind the stove. She took out the last of the lard. She mixed it with willow bark powder she had ground that morning and a small palmful of camphor, made a pulp. She unwrapped Otto's hands, cleaned the damaged tissue with a cloth dipped in boiled water, packed the pulp into the wounds, rewrapped the hands in fresh cloth, fed him willow bark tea with a spoon, 3 spoonfuls before he turned his face away. The fever climbed, and here is the moment, not the storm, not the trial, not the verdict, this moment. Midnight on Sunday, the 6th night, Otto's temperature high enough that he had stopped sweating, which Airlie's understood was the body beginning to give up the argument. Nora held him. She rocked him. She sang in a low, unsteady voice, a song from Vermont, from her own childhood, about a small boat going home across a harbor in the evening. Airlie stood beside the stove and listened, and she thought about Lucas, about the lullaby, about Britta Fry sitting up in bed eating thin broth in December, about the mitten with the needle still in it, about what Peter had been trying to build for his son, about what she was trying to build, and whether it was enough. She walked to the chest of drawers beside her bed. She knelt on the floor. She pulled open the bottom drawer. She lifted out the wooden box. She set it on the floor beside her. She opened it. The brown wool mittens lay inside, wrapped in the same piece of soft wool they had lived in for 5 years. She lifted them out, set them on the floor, looked at them for a moment. Beneath the mittens at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in a separate cloth, was the thing she had not touched since Wisconsin. She unwrapped it.
47 gold dollar coins in a small leather pouch, United States Mint, dated between 1875 and 1887, every one of them saved by Peter Veldhuis, one or two at a time, over 12 years of carpentry work in the Netherlands and Wisconsin. He had pressed the pouch into her hands in October of 1889, 2 months before he died, and said in his careful Dutch, "This is for the next bad year. Do not spend it on anything that is not the next bad year." $47. Enough for a one-way ticket by rail and stage to Minneapolis. Enough to live for 6 weeks in Ragna's house while she tried to find work. Enough to leave Wyoming with options instead of with nothing. Her entire reserve, her only escape if the April hearing went wrong and she lost everything. She held the pouch. She looked at Otto. Then she stood up and walked across the room to where Callum Vreede sat dozing beside the stove. "Mr. Vreede," she said, "wake up." Callum woke. "When the storm breaks," she said, "you're going to ride to Thaddeus Hollins's ranch. He'll give you a young calf. You'll pay him with this." She held out the pouch. Callum looked at it, did not take it. "Miss Veldhuis, it's for a calf," she said. "That's more than a calf costs by a factor of 10, and you know it. Then it's for a calf and a doctor from Cheyenne if the rail line is clear, and whatever else that boy needs. Miss Veldhuis, Mr. Vreede." She placed the pouch in his hand, closed his fingers around it, did not let go for a moment. "Peter left me this money for the next bad year." She looked at him. "This is the next bad year." Callum looked down at the pouch in his hand. He looked back up at her. He was 24 years old, and he had been in Wyoming for 8 months, and he had not yet seen enough of the world to have developed the ability to receive grace without it showing on his face. "I understand," he said. Across the room, Nora Pell had stopped singing. She was watching them. She did not fully understand what had passed between them. She understood only that something to do with her son, something to do with the wooden box. She looked at Airlies. Airlies met her eyes, and, in the particular wordless language that women who have lost things develop between them, the language that has no name and needs none, Nora understood that the woman across the room had just handed over the last of her reserves for Otto. She covered her mouth with her hand. Airlies had already turned back to the stove. She kept her hand on Otto's forehead through the long hours of Sunday night, through Monday dawn. The fever climbed, held, climbed again, and then somewhere around 4 in the morning of Monday the 29th, with no announcement, no drama, no particular moment she could point to, afterward, the fever broke. She felt it under her hand, the slow loosening of the heat, the skin cooling by degrees, the breathing deepening. She lifted her hand from his forehead. She sat back on her heels. She looked toward the south-facing windows. The light coming through the snow against the glass was different, pale blue, pre-dawn, and the wind that had screamed without interruption for 132 hours, was gone. The silence woke everyone simultaneously, pulled Reverend Aldrich upright in his chair, brought Nora's eyes open, made Callum reach instinctively for his coat. Airlie stood up. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the bolt. "It's over," she said. She slid the bolt back. She pushed the door against the snow. It opened 6 inches and stopped. She put her shoulder against it. 12 inches. Callum came up beside her, and the two of them pushed together until the gap was wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The cold came in like a knife, 29 below zero, but still, the world was still. She stepped out onto the porch. 8 inches of snow on the porch boards, a 3-foot drift against the door, and beyond the porch nothing she recognized. The high plains had become a single white surface, unbroken, stretching in every direction, without a fence or a tree or a road, to tell you where anything had been. She stood there. The stars above her were extraordinary, the kind of stars that only appear after a storm has scoured the atmosphere clean sharp and close and indifferent, the way stars always are, the way that used to bother her and no longer did. The barn above her quarters was still standing, the south wall intact, the north wall pushed inward by the snow load. She could see the bow in the roof line from below, but the main framing holding, the diagonal bracing doing exactly what diagonal bracing is designed to do. She had built it for this. She just hadn't known how completely this would test it. It took all 5 of them 3 hours to dig a path from the south-facing door to open ground. They emerged onto the surface just before noon and found a world that no longer resembled the world they had left. Nora's frame house 4 miles to the southeast. Gone, not damaged, gone. The foundation stones visible above the snow line like a row of broken teeth. The surveyor's shack where Callum had been staying. Splinters scattered across a 1/4 mile of ice. Reverend Aldrich's church, buried to the eave line. The cross on the roof, the only thing still visible. Thaddeus Hollins arrived on horseback at 12:47, leading 2 spare horses. He pulled up short when he saw all 5 of them standing outside the barn. He sat on his horse for a long moment. "You're alive," he said, and in his voice was something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but lived in the space between them. He climbed down. He looked at each of them in turn. Reverend Aldrich, Nora Pell, Callum Vreedy. Otto, standing between his mother and Airlies, with his wrapped hands held carefully at his sides. Then he looked at Airlies. 38 people, he said, across the territory, 11 in Laramie alone, froze in their own homes when the wood ran out or the chimneys failed or the walls let through. What walls in this territory let through in a storm like that? He looked at her structure. The barn with the north wall bowed but standing, the small chimney above the snow line still warm, still drawing a thin thread of smoke into the still air. "Do you know what you've built here?" he said. Airlies looked at her own work. She thought about the answer for a moment. "A place where the cold can't reach," she said. Thaddeus Hollins shook his head slowly. "You've built an argument," he said, "and in April you're going to make it." The federal hearing was held in Cheyenne on the morning of April 14th, 1894. The hearing room was on the 2nd floor of the land office building, wood-paneled, 3 windows facing east, a long table for the commissioner and his clerk, a smaller table for the petitioner, a row of chairs along the wall for witnesses. The hearing was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 6. Roscoe Duvall was not present in person. He had submitted his challenge in writing. His attorney, a polished young man from Denver named Wickfield, with a leather portfolio and the careful smile of a man who had won 17 of his last 20 land office challenges, sat across from Airlies at the petitioner's table. Airlies sat alone, one sheet of paper in front of her. She wore a black dress. She had altered herself from a dress that had been her mother's. Her hair was pulled back. Her hands were folded on the table. The acting commissioner was named Samuel Pruitt, 62 years old, 29 years in the land office, known in Cheyenne as a man who did not enjoy being managed. Wickfield opened. He spoke for 40 minutes. He cited Section 4 of the Homestead Act of 1862. He cited 4 federal precedents from Nebraska and the Dakota Territory. He argued with great precision that a structure consisting primarily of subterranean excavation, regardless of its functional warmth, regardless of its thermal performance, regardless of what had occurred inside it on the nights of January 23rd through 29th, did not constitute a habitable dwelling within the meaning of the statute. He asked the commissioner to revoke Miss Veldhuis's claim. Then the door at the back of the room opened, and Magnus Fry walked in. Earlies had not asked him to come. She had not seen him since the October morning he had stood on her porch, turning his hat in his hands, and told her he couldn't testify. She had not known he was coming until this moment. He was wearing his Sunday suit. His wife Hilda was 3 steps behind him, and behind Hilda, walking carefully, color in her cheeks, her dark hair pinned up, was Britta. Magnus walked past Earlies's table without looking at her. He walked straight to the witness bench. He sat down. He waited to be sworn. When asked his profession, he gave it. When asked how long he had built homestead structures in the United States of America, he said 31 years. When asked to assess the structure in question on its engineering merits, he spoke for 28 minutes. He explained the foundation work, the bedrock anchor at 17 feet, the load distribution of the joist system, the drainage calculations, the thermal mass principle, the south-facing windows, the ventilation design, the snow load capacity of the barn above. He explained why the structure had maintained 63 degrees Fahrenheit while the temperature outside was 41 below zero for 6 consecutive days. He spoke in his German accented English, and the room listened without interrupting. When Wickfield rose to cross-examine him, Magnus looked at him directly. "Before your first question," Magnus said, "you should know that I am here today against the explicit instructions of Roscoe Duvall, who holds the mortgage on my farm, and who has communicated to me in writing that my appearance at this hearing will result in immediate foreclosure proceedings." A pause. "I am here regardless. My wife told me to come." He looked at the clerk. "I would like that on the record." Commissioner Pruitt nodded to the clerk. The clerk wrote it down. Wickfield did not have a follow-up question. Callum Vreed testified next. He brought engineering drawings he had prepared over the previous 2 months, scale drawings of the complete structure cross-sections showing the thermal gradient snow load, calculations, temperature measurements he had personally recorded on 3 visits to the property in February of 1894. He was 24 years old and had never testified at anything in his life, and his hands were shaking slightly when he set the drawings on the table. But the drawings were precise. The numbers were correct. He spoke for 19 minutes. The drawings were entered into evidence. Reverend Aldrich testified. He described the night of January 23rd. He described walking through the storm. He described what he found when Earlies opened the door. He described 6 days inside a structure that held 63 degrees in the worst blizzard the territory had seen in a generation. His voice broke once. He let it. Then he said something he had not planned to say. "I preached in August that a woman living alone this way was not in keeping with right order," he said. "I was wrong about that. I want that on the record also." The commissioner nodded to the clerk. The clerk wrote it down. Nora Pell testified. She was brief and she was specific, and she brought Otto with her. The boy stood beside his mother at the witness table, and he held up both hands when the commissioner asked him to. The tips of 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 on his left had been removed at the first joint by a surgeon in Cheyenne, paid for by the 47 gold coins Callum had carried out of the homestead on the morning of January 29th. The remaining fingers were healed. He could hold a pencil. He had demonstrated this for the surgeon who had documented it. Commissioner Pruitt looked at Otto's hands for a long moment. Then he looked at Earlies. Then he looked back at his papers. The final witness was Thaddeus Hollins. He carried a leather portfolio of his own. Inside the portfolio were maps. He laid them on the table in front of the commissioner. He explained calmly and at length what he had spent the previous 3 months assembling through a personal contact at the Union Pacific offices in Denver, through the public record of land registrations in the Laramie Land Office, through a surveyor's report he had commissioned himself. The first map showed the proposed route of the Union Pacific Northern Extension spur line through the high plains north of Laramie. The route that had been surveyed in the spring of 1893 and filed confidentially with the railroad's offices in Denver. The second map showed the 10-quarter sections that Roscoe J. Duvall had quietly purchased over the previous 20 months, each one along the proposed route, each one acquired through private transaction without public announcement. The third document was a copy of the private investment agreement between Roscoe J. Duvall and the Union Pacific Northern Extension Project, signed on the 14th of September, 1892, 4 months before the formal challenge to Airlies Veldhuis's claim was filed. 3 months before he offered her a loan, Holland set all 3 documents on the table. Mr. Duvall's challenge was filed, Holland said, while he held an undisclosed financial interest in acquiring the property in question as an appointed member of this office's own advisory board. Commissioner Pruitt was quiet for a long time. He read every document. He recessed the hearing at 4 in the afternoon. He ruled the following morning. He did not dismiss the underlying statutory question whether a subterranean dwelling qualified under Section 4 of the Homestead Act. He said that was a matter for Congress to clarify. He ruled instead that the challenge had been brought in bad faith by an appointed officer of the advisory board with an undisclosed financial interest in the outcome, and that under those circumstances, no consideration could be given to the substance of the challenge. Miss Veldhuis's claim was confirmed in full. He referred the matter of Mr. Duvall's conduct to the territorial governor for review. Airlies rode back from Cheyenne alone. The road north from Cheyenne to Laramie took most of a day by horseback in April. She rode through high plains country that was just beginning to show the first pale green of spring grass coming up through last year's dead growth. The sky was clear. The wind was cold, but not the killing kind. She reached her property in the late afternoon. She put up her horse. She went down into her quarters. She sat at the table, and for the first time she did not know how long she had nothing she was required to do, no wood to calculate, no plaster to change, no letter to write or burn, no hearing to prepare for, no storm to survive, just the room, the afternoon light coming through the south-facing windows, the thermometer reading 61 degrees, the stove ticking quietly with a low fire. She sat there for a long time. She walked to the chest of drawers beside her bed. She pulled open the bottom drawer. She took out the wooden box. She set it on the table. She opened it. The brown wool mittens were inside. She lifted them out, held them, the finished one and the unfinished one, the needle still in the last row, the yarn still waiting. She sat with them in her hands, and she thought about Peter, not the way she usually thought about him with the specific gravity of a loss she was managing, but differently, lightly, the way a person thinks about someone they loved on an ordinary afternoon when nothing is wrong and there is time to simply remember. She thought about his hands, the way they looked when he was working, the particular concentration on his face when he was teaching himself something new. The tears came quietly, not the sharp kind, not the kind that comes from pain or from fighting something, the kind that comes when the fighting is over and the body finally understands it is allowed to put down what it has been carrying. She did not try to stop them. She sat there in the warm underground room with the April light on the floor and the mittens in her hands, and she cried for Peter, and she cried for Lucas, and she cried for the 4 years she had spent turning that grief into mortar and joists and bedrock anchors and thermometer readings. And when she was done, she sat quietly for a long time. The room was still warm. Of course it was. She had built it to stay warm. 2 days before Roscoe Duvall left Laramie for Denver, an envelope arrived at her homestead, hand-carried by a young man on a fast horse. No return address. Inside a single sheet of writing paper, 4 words in formal copperplate handwriting. She would have understood. Airlies read it. She sat with it for a moment. Then she walked to her stove. She opened the small iron door. She set the note on top of the burning logs. She watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. She closed the iron door. She did not respond. The note had not been a request for anything. It had been the closing of a ledger. She allowed it to close. Roscoe Duvall resigned from the advisory board within the week. He resigned from the presidency of the First Territorial Bank of Laramie 3 months later, sold the bank to a consortium from Denver at a loss of approximately $9,000. He relocated to Denver, then to Kansas City. He died in the winter of 1899. Pneumonia. He was 60 years old. His son James, who had been raised by his grandmother and who had seen his father perhaps 3 times a year throughout his childhood, and who had never been told the full story of the Wyoming land and the woman who built a house into a hillside, became a country doctor in eastern Kansas. He lived a quiet life. He delivered approximately 1,100 babies over the course of his career. He died in 1941 at the age of 63. The summers pass. In 1895, a builder from Cheyenne came to study her structure and asked permission to use the design principles. She gave it, did not charge him. In 1896, a writer from the Wyoming Tribune interviewed her for a piece on frontier construction. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. She did not save a copy. By the spring of 1897, the phrase Veldhuis-style construction had begun to appear in conversations from the Laramie Plains to the eastern slopes of the Wind River Range. The Territorial Agricultural Extension Office in Cheyenne published a small pamphlet that summer distributed free to new homesteaders containing scale drawings and construction notes based on her methods. The pamphlet was reprinted in 1899, in 1903, in 1908. Magnus Fry lost his farm in April of 1894, 3 weeks after the hearing. The bank foreclosed as promised. He and Hilda relocated to a small property east of Cheyenne, purchased with money lent to them by Thaddeus Hollins, an arrangement Hollins made quietly and documented carefully and never mentioned publicly. Magnus continued to build. He built 11 Veldhuis-style structures over the following decade. He never charged for the design consultation. He told the families who asked that he was repaying a debt he was not at liberty to describe. Hilda understood what he meant. She always had. Callum Vreda became a builder. He specialized in earth-integrated structures. By 1900, he had built more than 40 of them across the Wyoming and Colorado territories. He kept the leather journal of temperature records that Airlies gave him when he came to study her methods in the spring of 1894, kept it in the front pocket of his work bag, consulted it, the way a navigator consults charts, carried it to every site he worked for the next 30 years. Otto Pell's hands healed well enough. He became a teacher. He taught mathematics at a school in Laramie for 22 years. He wrote with the hand that still had all its fingers, the left in a precise, careful script that his students recognized as the handwriting of someone who had learned to work around loss and make it look like intention. He married in 1906. He named his first son Edmund for his father. His second son he named Peter. Nora Pell never fully understood why Airlies had suggested that name until years later when she finally asked, and Airlies, sitting on the south-facing porch of her quarters in the late afternoon light of an October day, older now, her hands showing the work of 20 years, looked at her and said simply, "Because some names should keep being said." Airlies lived in her quarters for 20 years. In 1913, she sold the homestead to a young couple from Ohio named Halverson. She walked them through every aspect of the structure's maintenance. She gave them her leather journal, 19 years of temperature records, snow load measurements, drainage observations, modifications. Every winter she had survived. every number she had written down. She told them one thing at the end. This structure was built to keep people alive. Remember that, and you'll know how to take care of it. She moved into Laramie, into Nora Pell's house on the west side of town, where Nora had been living alone since her second husband, a quiet man named Albert, had died of a stroke in 1909. They were both old women now, or what passes for old when you have worked as hard as they had worked. Airlies caught pneumonia in November of 1915. She was 72 years old. The pneumonia worsened over 9 days. On the morning of the 10th day, Nora sent for Otto. He came at once. He brought his son Peter with him, 14 years old, the boy who carried a name Airlies had given. Airlies was in the back bedroom, sitting up against 3 pillows, breathing with effort, but her mind clear. She asked Nora to bring her the wooden box. Nora brought it. Airlies opened it. The brown wool mittens were inside, wrapped in the same soft cloth they had lived in for 26 years. She lifted them out, the finished one and the unfinished one, the knitting needle still threaded through the last row of the right mitten, the yarn still uncut, still waiting. She looked at them the way she had looked at them on 1,000 evenings beside 1,000 small fires. Then she held them out to Otto. These belong to my husband, she said. His name was Peter. He made them for my son Lucas, who was 6 years old when he died. I have carried them for 26 years. Otto took them. He held them in both hands. He looked at his mother, who was crying quietly in the doorway. Then he looked back at Airlies. Why, he said, why are you giving them to me? Airlies looked at him for a long moment, at the man he had become, the teacher, the father, the man who wrote in careful, precise script with the hand that still had all its fingers. Because you lived, she said, and because your name means your mother didn't give up, and because these have been waiting long enough for someone to use them. She closed her eyes. She died at 11:41 that night. Nora held her hand. Outside the window of the small house on the west side of Laramie, the first snow of the season was falling in soft, thick flakes, quiet, unhurried, the way the best snowfalls come, not announcing themselves, just arriving. She is buried in the Laramie Cemetery on a small rise that faces south toward the Medicine Bow Range. Her marker is a piece of sandstone from the North Platte riverbed, cut and polished by Callum Vrede, with 3 lines of text on its face. Airlies Veldhuis, 1843 to 1915. She built into the earth, and the earth held her. Otto Pell placed the brown wool mittens on the top of the stone every January until his own hands couldn't manage the walk. His son Peter did it after him, Peter's daughter after that, each one a small refusal to let the cold have the last word. The homestead passed from the Halverson family to a historical preservation trust in the latter half of the 20th century. Engineers who visited the property in later decades validated Airlies's temperature records against their own measurements. The numbers held. Of course they did, because the woman who built that structure was not guessing. She was not hoping. She was not trusting to luck or to faith or to the goodwill of anyone who might or might not show up. She was paying attention, the way her father taught her, the way the lake had taught him. That is the legacy, not the headlines, not the obituary, not even the structures themselves, though the structures matter and continue to matter. The legacy is a pair of unfinished mittens placed on a stone in January, year after year after year, each placement saying the same thing in the only language that outlasts everything else, that she was here, that she built something real, that the cold came, and she was ready.